Welcome to another episode of From the Ground Up, where we help you start your faith or build your faith one step at a time. Today we are tackling topic 4, Jesus, crucifixion, the parable of the lost sons, and it's going to be a great conversation. And joining us today, I have my two wonderful colleagues from Grand Canyon University, Dr. Valerie De La Torre and Dr. Shelley Hogan. So thank you so much for joining us again, and I am excited to have you here. And I'm going to start out with Dr. Shelley and ask her a big question, but something that I would love to hear from her about. So why is the crucifixion of Jesus such a major event in the history of the Christian faith?
Well, sin requires a sacrifice. And if you pair it with the biblical, the Old Testament times, for every sin, there was a continual sacrifice. And Jesus became the once for all. So the crucifixion is the once and for all time, all people sacrifice for sin that God required for sin. And so he took on he did for us what we could not do for ourselves. He who was perfect and without sin, took on the sins of humanity, bore them to the cross. And, with the cross, we have to look at the resurrection, because his resurrection was victory over death and over sin. And so the crucifixion is that great, it makes me want to cry now, that great gift of mercy and grace that God the Son extended to us through the crucifixion.
Awesome. That is so true. Well, Dr. V, can you help us explain why the crucifixion is such a major event as well in the history of our Christian faith?
All of the Bible speaks of a sacrifice, as Dr. Shelley spoke of. Sacrifice in the Old Testament was to just ward off sins. It didn't take them away. In the New Testament, a sacrifice, a perfect sacrifice that was prophesied, as Dr. Shelley alluded to, would take sins away forever. And Jesus not only was that sacrificial lamb per the scriptures and the story and the whole history of how Israel functioned in its worship life, but Jesus not only died, he suffered and died. And that is an important element that helps us relate to how we suffer in all aspects of our lives. So crucifixion, Jesus didn't die by hanging. Jesus didn't die by getting shot, an easy death. It was a torturous, horrible, horrific death at a certain time in history that really sets his death apart from everybody else.
Yeah, the horrificness of it. And it kind of ties in what we spoke about last week with suffering, and that he is the suffering servant. So, in thinking about the crucifixion and how that plays into our Christian walk, also some of the parables that Jesus shared when he was alive, can you make a connection between the parable of the prodigal son? I want to take us there and make that connection between the bigger picture of the story in relation to why Jesus, the purpose of Jesus coming into this world, that he would die on the cross.
The crucifixion, the act of crucifixion, but the end of that is death. And it is death that separates us, spiritual and physical death. I mentioned this in our last series, that separates us from God. And this act of crucifixion, this suffering, brings us that closure, brings us into relationship with God. It's kind of an oxymoron that something terrible would bring up something good. So that's how we get to the stories in the New Testament about salvation, about someone that is dead coming back into the good graces of God when we look at the parable of the prodigal son.
Excellent. Dr. Shelley, can you share some insight into the parable of the prodigal son or the lost son? I tend to call it the parable of the lost sons. Would you share some insight into that parable?
I would agree with the lost sons. They were both prodigals in that sense, both lost. One was lost in servitude. See, God will only accept us as sons or daughters, not as servants or slaves. And both those sons were trying to come back into relationship with the father as servants or slaves. The older son served. He was out in the field when he should have been next to the father. And the younger son decided a whole bargaining conversation. He practiced his speech that I'll sell myself to my father as a servant instead of a son. And the father would have no part of that. And that is with God. Sin separates us from God. But the crucifixion, the death of Jesus Christ, opens the doorway for reconciliation back to God, back to relationship. And the prodigal son's story shows that in such a beautiful way, that no matter what we have done, no matter what the suffering, God opens his arms to us, which would be the cross, opens his arms to us through Jesus Christ, and invites us not into religion, not into slavery, but into relationship. We are his children, and he is our father. And the prodigal story just exhibits that so beautifully and so richly. It's one of my favorites.
Amen to that.
Yeah, mine too. Mine too. And we could probably talk for hours about the parable of the prodigal son, lost sons, the parable of the compassionate father. There are so many different names for this parable, but I just want to thank you for sharing. And we're a little bit out of time, but next week we're going to talk about Jesus's resurrection, salvation, what it means to be justified, justification, sanctification, all the big words, theological terms. We're going to try to tackle them in just a few short minutes. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, friends and audience, for joining us on this episode of From the Ground Up. And click like and subscribe if you want to see more content. We'll see you next time. Bye.